In today's episode and the next one, we will dive into the dark world of the nuclear forces of the United States and their Cold War rival, the Soviet Union. In particular, we will discuss nuclear events gone wrong. That is, tests that yielded far more than expected, so-called broken arrow events, and near misses with nuclear war. For part one, we will limit the topic to the actual testing of atomic and thermonuclear devices. Broken arrows and near misses will be the topic of part two. While the subject matter is dark, it remains a very important topic today, and it is a subject with some personal connections for me. So stay tuned for more about this fascinating topic. Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Me, Myself, and I History, where weird history and strange happenings in the universe are always on the menu. My name is Seraphim. As I begin this episode, please indulge me as I share a couple of family stories to give some context to this episode and why this topic is near and dear to my heart. I promise to keep them reasonably short. We live in a nuclear world. Nuclear energy has, for the most part, been used for peaceful purposes. We use it to generate electricity, to explore the physics of the universe, and power satellites and space probes. However, it started out primarily as a weapon developed for the Manhattan Project during World War II, resulting in 2 atomic bombs that were used over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan in August of 1945. These horrific weapons helped fuel the Cold War. My maternal great-grandmother was a divorcee with 2 teenagers to feed during World War II. She applied as a dorm matron for the U.S. federal government. It was a great time for women to get on board with the U.S. federal government as all the men were away fighting the war. She had no idea where she was going to be assigned, but she needed secure work and this job offered housing to boot. She had no idea just how secure that work would be. She got off the train in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and was picked up and taken to a remote mountain plateau that today is about a 45-minute drive north of Santa Fe. Back then it was a much longer ride. The road up there was a single-lane dirt path carved into the side of a prominence with occasional pullouts so the cars could pass each other. It was evidently a military facility. There was an imposing guard gate at the top and very well-armed military police were everywhere in evidence. She had come to Los Alamos, a secret facility that did not yet officially exist. Here she met the man who would become the love of her life. My step-great-grandfather was a good New Jersey Polish Catholic boy. He joined the army in 1944 and was bucking to fight the Nazis in Europe. He was trained as a supply sergeant. He wanted to get as close to the front as he could. The Nazis had attacked his ancestral homeland, and that demanded an answer. He was literally in line to board the troop ship for Europe when the MPs pulled him out and told him he had been reassigned. He was decidedly not happy about this, but they threatened him with arrest if he didn't come with them. Soon, he was on a train to Santa Fe, and a few hours after arrival, he too was on a bus up that hill in the mountains of northern New Mexico. Grandpa deliberately shirked duty for a month, thinking that he would get sent to the front. He had no idea that he was now too valuable to be allowed out of the U.S. because of his knowledge of this facility he had been brought to. After a month, he got bored and asked his lieutenant for a job so that he had something to do. He got assigned to a supply closet. That's where he met my great-grandmother when she came to requisition cleaning supplies one day. They got married after the war. Grandpa went into retail and Grandma went on to become a postmistress and later a data analyst at the labs in Los Alamos. I now tell people that nuclear family means something different to us. Family jokes aside, my father's family was also touched by nuclear weapons testing. My great-uncle was one of the Marines exposed to atmospheric nuclear testing at the Nevada test site. He later developed cancer and lost nearly all the hair on his body permanently. In his later years, he had a few straggly hairs on the top of his head that grew back. He kept a comb in the front pocket of his bib overalls that he used to religiously comb them with. And he always ate strawberry ice cream with us when he came over to visit. It was something that always generated smiles and a few giggles when the family talked about it. Those two are as close as I have ever come to a nuclear weapon besides driving past what were obviously nuclear missile silos in the Missouri Ozarks when I was growing up. What started as a superweapon to end World War II and beat the Nazis to the punch ended as a genie let out of a bottle that will likely never go back in. Soon, the Soviet Union also had their own nuclear program, and just 4 years later, in 1949, years ahead of expectations, they detonated their first test weapon. They had spies among the scientists at Los Alamos and elsewhere. With tensions rising higher and higher between the Soviets and their erstwhile allies of the late war, the weapons development for a war that both sides feared as inevitable took high priority. Of course, atomic and later thermonuclear weapons would take a very high priority in the grand scheme of things. Several other countries would follow developing their own weapons. The United States created the Pacific Proving Grounds in the Marshall Islands and a few other locations starting in 1946. The most famous of these islands is the Bikini Atoll, where the first test took place. Being one of the most isolated places on Earth, it was a great choice for the U.S. military to begin testing the effects of the weapons and to develop more powerful warheads. The first shot of Project Crossroads was on 1 July 1946. A bomb was dropped from a B-29 Superfortress and detonated at an altitude of 520 feet or 158 meters above the atoll. A corps of journalists were present on the ship some distance out from Ground Zero to witness the event. Some noted with dismay that of 18 ships placed nearby for the test, most were merely damaged. Only 2 sunk immediately, 2 within a few hours, and 1 the next day. The reason for the poor performance was that the bomb missed its target detonation area by 710 yards or 649 meters. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal told reporters it was due to the heavy armor on some ships and that they needed to be damaged below the waterline to sink. The truth was that the bombardier had miscalculated the drop and missed his target. The Baker shot, the second in the series, was placed directly under a landing ship, LSM-60, in the Bikini Lagoon, about 90 feet or 27.4 meters below the surface. It was in close proximity to several other ships, including the German war trophy ship, the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen. This device yielded a 21-kiloton blast. Several ships were destroyed by this blast, proving that it could be effective against naval assets. No identifiable piece of LSM-60 was ever located. It was assumed vaporized in the blast. The Prinz Eugen, which had already survived the Able shot, also survived this blast as well, though it was now leaking, and the radiation levels were far too high to repair it for use in further testing. It was towed to the Kwajalein Atoll, and unable to be rescued, she capsized and sank in December 1946. Today, one of the screw propellers is visible in the air in the shallow waters where it sank. In the ongoing effort to create ever more powerful detonations, weapons designers and engineers figured out how to create a thermonuclear detonation in 1952, but in 1954 a miscalculation happened. The Bravo shot for Castle Test Series was predicted to have a 6 megaton blast yield. It was nearly 3 times that size. For comparison, the Baker shot we just spoke of 8 years earlier had a blast crater 30 feet or 9 meters deep by 2,000 feet or 610 meters wide. Castle Bravo had a crater that was 186 feet or 54 meters deep and more than a mile or 1.6 kilometers across. The mushroom cloud topped out at 135,000 feet or 41,000 meters high. Pulverized coral landed at Utirik Atoll 301 miles or 484 kilometers away. The blast yield was around 15 megatons. That power difference was achieved in just 8 years. Atomic Annie. Nothing went wrong here per se. I just wanted to show you what a tactical nuclear weapon detonation looks like. This was the kind of detonation that my great-uncle was exposed to. Now, I don't know which test he observed, but it would have been one like this in the Nevada test site. Atomic Annie, the M65 artillery piece, is the largest cannon ever put into service for the United States at 280mm bore diameter. It debuted in Dwight D. Eisenhower's inaugural parade in January 1953. On 29 May 1953, it fired the one and only atomic artillery shell ever fired. It was a Mark 9 tactical nuclear round at Frenchman's Flat at the Nevada test site, which is now part of Nellis Air Force Base today. It was 15 kilotons, or about the same strength as the Able shot just 7 years earlier, but this time it was from an artillery cannon, not a bomber. Just 8 more years after Castle Bravo, another notable nuclear accident took place. Operation Dominic on the Johnston Atoll had a sub-program called Operation Fishbowl. Operation Fishbowl was a sequence of 5 thermonuclear tests conducted by the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission and the Defense Atomic Support Agency. The operation was hastily put together after the August 1961 announcement by the Soviet Union that they were ending their 3-year moratorium on nuclear testing. The program called for thermonuclear weapons, 2 low-yield and 3 high-yield ones, to be detonated in space. Starfish Prime would be the most powerful of these. The launch vehicle was the PGM-17 Thor missile. The Thor missile was an intermediate-range ballistic missile put into service as a stopgap measure while a full intercontinental ballistic missile, later known as the Atlas missile, was still in development. After 1959, the Thor was now technically obsolete and available for testing scenarios like this one. Starfish Prime launched on the evening of 9 July 1962 at 9 seconds past 11 p.m. Honolulu time. A bright flash was observed in Hawaii, which was 900 miles or 1,448 kilometers away. The weapon had detonated at an altitude of 250 miles or 400 kilometers and had an explosive yield of around 1.4 megatons. The ensuing electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, was far larger than expected. It knocked out around 300 streetlights in Honolulu, set off numerous burglar alarms all over the islands, and knocked out a microwave tower owned by a local phone company, cutting off all calls from Kauai to the other islands. In the following months, the radiation from the detonation damaged or disabled several satellites in low Earth orbit. There was one positive outcome of this test. The following year, the U.S. and the USSR signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which the two countries had been haggling over for years. It banned all further atmospheric and space testing of nuclear devices, but a little more on that in the next section. Not all of the mistakes and miscalculations in nuclear testing have been on the part of the United States. The Soviet Union had some too. Though not last, sequentially speaking, this one is the most influential, so I'm placing it last for that reason. The Russian Federation released a fair amount of information and film footage to the public regarding the Soviet nuclear program a few years ago. While much of it remains to be analyzed and translated for public consumption in the West, we do know a few things. The best known of these was the Tsar Bomba, or Emperor Bomb in English, which was tested on 30 October 1961. It was the most powerful detonation of a nuclear device ever. It was also the device that was built immediately after the Soviets lifted their moratorium on atmospheric testing. It had been in the design stages for over a year before that. Although meant as a proof-of-concept device and meant to saber-rattle the West, the device scared a lot of folks in the West who wondered just what were the Soviets up to and why. The project began on paper in 1960. Originally, it was designed to be a 100 megaton or 418 petajoule detonation. This would be achieved by 3 stages. Stage 1 would use a uranium bullet design to create a very small, fast fission explosion. This, in turn, would detonate the second stage, which was composed of 2 small thermonuclear devices. These 2 stages would contribute 50 megatons or 209 petajoules to the total explosion. The third stage, composed of uranium-238, would add another 50 megatons to the detonation. Soviet weapon engineers decided to leave the third stage out altogether and replace it with passive material. The uranium tamper on the second stage charges were replaced with lead, further reducing the fission reaction and leaving the detonation to be 97% thermonuclear fusion. The total yield would be about 50 megatons or 209 petajoules. Once the bomb design was agreed upon and developed and manufactured, it would need a delivery vehicle. The Soviets had one bomber capable of delivering such a mammoth weapon, the recently developed Tupolev Tu-95 bomber, a vehicle which is still in service with the Russian Federation to this day. Really though, the Tu-95 bomber wasn't big enough. A special testbed version, the Tu-95V, had to be modified from a frontline version. The bomb bay doors had to be removed altogether, and two of the fuselage fuel tanks had to be removed as well before the device could be hoisted up to the aircraft. An entirely new bomb holder, much heavier than the original, needed to be installed. Even for all of this, more than 2/3 of the device was hanging outside of the aircraft. The undersides of the fuselage, wings, engine nacelles, and even the propellers had to be painted in a special anti-flash white paint to prevent damage to the aircraft and its crew. Despite this, Major Dernovtsev, the bomber commander, was given only a 50% chance of survival for him and his crew. First Secretary of the Communist Party and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev let it slip to an American diplomat the Soviets would be testing a 50-megaton bomb in the coming days on 8 September 1961. On 17 October, at the 22nd Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev announced the test officially in his opening report to the party. The test took place on 30 October 1961, on the penultimate day of the Congress. That day, Major Andrei Yegorovich Dernovtsev commanded the testbed aircraft. His bomber, along with a Tu-16 laboratory aircraft, took off for the Novaya Zemlya State Test Site No. 6. The Tsar Bomba was 30 short tons or 27 metric tons, including an 1,800-pound or 800-kilogram parachute to slow the device's descent and give a more accurate altitude detonation point. This also brought a 3-minute and 8-second window for the planes to get 28 miles or 45 kilometers distance from the blast. The bomb deployed without a hitch from an altitude of 34,449 feet, or 10,500 meters. At 13,780 feet, or 4,200 meters above the ground, the device detonated at 11:32 a.m. Moscow time. At this time, the Tu-95 was 24 miles, or 39 kilometers, away from the blast, and the Tu-16 was slightly ahead of that distance. The shockwave caught up to the Tu-95 71 miles or 115 kilometers away. They lost 1,000 meters or nearly 3,300 feet of altitude, but were able to recover and return to base. Afterwards, Major Dernovtsev and his crew received the Hero of the Soviet Union medal. Here are some interesting facts about this terrible weapon. First, the fireball was about 5 miles or 8 kilometers across. The shock wave was so powerful that the fireball could not touch the surface of the target area, making it one of the least polluting nuclear devices ever detonated because very little fissionable material was used and no fallout was created. Testers appearing at the hypocenter of the explosion one day later recorded only 1 milliröntgen per hour of radiation, non-radioactive for all intents and purposes, since the average European is exposed to around 20 milliröntgen per hour of ambient radiation. The seismic shock wave circled the Earth 3 times before dissipating, registering on every seismograph in use at the time. The atmospheric shock wave did the same thing, though it took 3 days to achieve this based on measurements taken at Wellington, New Zealand. The mushroom cloud left the troposphere, entered and then passed through the stratosphere and entered the mesosphere bordering outer space. That made it 8 times taller than Mount Everest. It was 25 miles or 40 kilometers wide at its base, and the cap of the cloud was 59 miles or 95 kilometers across. The flash could be seen 620 miles or 1,000 kilometers away. Windows were shattered at Dixon Island 480 miles or 780 kilometers away, though some places closer to the blast reported no damage. The flash damaged an American KC-135 that had been modified as a sniffing aircraft and had been dispatched to the area, burning the anti-flash paint off of large parts of the aircraft. This is probably the strangest part of the facts surrounding this weapon. It was already obsolete by the time of its use because ICBMs had been developed and could reach anywhere on Earth without any risk of being shot down at the time. It also scared both sides so much that a partial nuclear test ban treaty was entered into, banning signatories from any atmospheric or space testing of nuclear weapons. In the common talk at the Party Congress the next day, the Tsar Bomba would gain a second nickname, Kuzma's mother. The name comes from a Soviet-era expression to show someone Kuzma's mother, which meant something like the English expression to give them the what for, or to threaten them with severe consequences for something, much like the current colloquialism FAFO. If you don't know what that means, look it up. I'm going to keep it polite here. While the U.S. appears to take the cake when it comes to the sheer number of nuclear miscalculations, the USSR wins hands down for producing a bomb that scared even their own politicians into toning down the rhetoric. This weapon scared the NATO side of the Cold War so much that every time the topic of nuclear forces came up, the members of the NATO side of the nuclear club repeatedly insisted on making more and more weapons to make up for the bomber gap and the missile gap. The Soviets undoubtedly had more, bigger, and more accurate versions than we had, it was said. As it turns out, that was dead wrong on all points. The Soviets were a decade or two behind in the technology. They relied heavily on data stolen by spies with little in the way of original technological development. They had significantly fewer bombers, bombs, and missiles, and quite frankly, they were more afraid of us than we were of them, as we discovered when the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s. It took far more than these things to implement the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and later the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, but it was a good start. If we can't exactly put this genie back in the bottle, we can at least put a leash on it. If you liked today's episode, please hit those like and subscribe buttons and hit that notification bell to be alerted to more amazing content from this channel. Then tell your friends and family who like weird history and strange events. Until next time, when I bring you part 2, my friends, this is Seraphim with Me, Myself, and I History signing off.